Hi, and welcome again to another episode of the End Your Pain, Live Again show. I am your host, Dr. Mitchell Yass, and in this episode, we're going to talk about a very commonly given diagnosis for shoulder pain. And I want to talk about the diagnosis itself, whether the symptoms that people present with actually justify the diagnosis, and what are the more potential causes of pain at the shoulder. The diagnosis that I'm going to be discussing is the diagnosis of frozen shoulder, or technically adhesive capsulitis. Before I continue, I just want to mention that the purpose of this podcast is to create awareness of the Yass method, which sits outside the medical establishment. It utilizes a method of interpreting the body's presentation of symptoms to evaluate what tissue is in distress, creating those very symptoms. The use of the MRI or other diagnostic tests is baseless. Every bit of evidence proves that. So, for anybody who has obtained a diagnosis by means of a diagnostic test, there is the highest probability, in fact, more than a 95% chance that you've been misdiagnosed, which is what led me to create the Yass method. So, if you're listening to this and you're having shoulder pain and you believe you've been misdiagnosed, or you just happen to be listening to this episode and you're saying to yourself, wow, the Yass method actually sounds like the right method for me to establish the cause of my pain and help resolve it, you can reach me by email at drmitch@mitchellyass.com, DRMITCH at MITCHELLYASS.com. I'll have it in the description for the podcast. And you can also, if you believe that the Yass method is the right path for you, the great news is that you can get the Yass method virtually by going to my website, www.livewithoutpains.com /sessions. Again, live without pains, it's plural, /sessions. And you could schedule a Yass method Zoom session. This allows you to select the day and time that is most comfortable for you to have the session. You don't have to have an in person session, although, if you happen to live in the Jacksonville area, that's great. You can come and see me in Jacksonville, Florida. But if you don't, regardless of where you are in the world, a Yass Method Zoom session is highly effective. I highly recommend it for being able to establish the cause of your pain. And if, in fact, you're one of those in the 95% or greater percentile who has a muscular cause, all that happens is I will demonstrate a series of exercises. You will perform them under my supervision. The sessions are videotaped, so use that going forward to make sure that you're doing your exercises correctly. We recommend 4-week follow-up sessions. And then, with a very short period of time, you're pain-free and fully functional. So, again, the Yass method sits outside the medical system. It has a completely unique way of diagnosing, as I said, interpreting the body's presentation of symptoms, which is what the body actually, that's why you have symptoms, is that the tissue is in distress and is trying to create conscious awareness of the distress of the tissue. And therefore, it elicits symptoms to make you aware of that. And as I said, in more than 95% of cases, actually more than 98% of cases, the cause of pain, I have proven over 30 years, is muscular. So it just takes the right understanding of which muscles, how to perform the appropriate exercises, and how to use progressive resistance to strengthen the muscles until the point at which the muscle force output is greater than the force requirement of your activities, and you're pain-free and fully functional. And as long as you maintain the exercises, you can remain pain-free and fully functional. So, without further ado, let's get into the diagnosis of frozen shoulder. I can't even possibly fathom how many people have come to me over the last 28 years with shoulder region pain and were given the diagnosis of frozen shoulder. And typically that was followed with a couple of cortisone shots, which at best can only mask the symptoms. Clearly, a shot cannot resolve a tissue in distress. So, with almost every one of those cases, in fact, I can't remember a specific case where the person presented with the correct symptoms to justify the diagnosis of frozen shoulder. And almost every single one of the people that I treated with that diagnosis, I was able to rebut the diagnosis based on the presentation of symptoms and prove there was no chance in hell the person had frozen shoulder. So I want you to protect yourself, and I want you to have the information so that there's less chance of you being misdiagnosed and kind of sent through a system that's unwilling to acknowledge. They simply don't interpret symptoms. They accept diagnostic testing. Therefore, they're leading you towards misdiagnosis. I'd rather you not go through that system. And if you have this information, that's going to help you. So, what is frozen shoulder? Well, technically, it is called adhesive capsulitis. And what that represents is the fact that all movable joints are comprised of two bones that approximate one another, and there is a joint space between them that is maintained typically by a meniscus or a labrum. A piece of cartilage holds the space. At the ends of the two bones that approximate one another, there is something called hyaline cartilage. It is an extremely hard, smooth type of cartilage, and it is the type of cartilage that absorbs the forces when the joint is moved and the bones approximate one another to create range of motion. Those cartilages, the hyaline cartilage, has no blood supply. So the only way it gets nutrients is through the synovial fluid that remains within the joint. To keep the fluid, synovial fluid, in the joint, the body has provided a joint capsule. So the capsule surrounds the joint, keeping synovial fluid in the joint, providing the nutrients for the hyaline cartilage so that the joint could remain healthy. Now, there is a possibility through either a mechanical deficit or systemic deficit that you could develop adhesions on the capsule. Well, in the case of the shoulder, what makes the shoulder joint so unique is the fact that it's the only joint that allows you to have a 360-degree range of motion. So, for every joint, there's always going to be this trade off between stability and mobility. So, if you have a very, very stable joint, say for instance, the hip joint, you're probably not going to have a lot of mobility. And sure enough, there's just not that much range of motion, maybe 120 degrees of range of motion at any particular way in the hip joint. But now we're talking about the shoulder joint, we're talking about 360 degrees of range of motion. So, with that understanding, you have to assume that there's very little stability, which is true. If you look at the glenoid fossa, the side of the joint that's represented by the shoulder blade, it's very, very shallow. And there's very limited ligament that supports the joint. That's why it's the only joint that has a dynamic stabilizer, which is your rotator cuff. But for this to have this kind of range of motion, the bones have to shift on one another excessively. There is a massive amount of gliding that is necessary to allow 360 degrees of range of motion. So, as a result of that, the joint capsule has to be fairly flaccid, fairly loose, other than when you're reaching that optimal point of full range of motion. So, the joint capsule in the case of the shoulder must be very loose. Well, if you develop adhesions on the joint capsule, it impedes the freedom of the joint capsule to allow the joint and those bones to glide to the point at which you could develop this full range of motion. So, what you must understand is that there is a structural impedance of range of motion. I'll say it again. There is a structural impedance of range of motion. The joint capsule in adhesive capsulitis has developed adhesions which makes the joint capsule taut and does not allow for the normal gliding and range of motion of the joint. So, for you to have the diagnosis of frozen shoulder be legitimate, pain is not the determining factor as to whether you could give that diagnosis. I could hit you with a baseball bat. You'll have pain, but trust me, you don't have frozen shoulder. So forget pain, whether you have pain or not. That doesn't justify the diagnosis. You have to have a major loss of range of motion. So that means that if you try to raise your arm in front of you or to the side of you, you can't. If you legitimately had frozen shoulder, you probably couldn't even reach shoulder height. Now, here's the part that you want to understand that separates frozen shoulder from a muscular cause. Now, you may not be able to raise your arm, but what I want to check as a legitimate practitioner and a person looking at the body's presentation of symptoms, when someone has a major loss of range of motion actively, I've got to look at it what is known as passively. I'm going to tell you to fully relax your arm, just be totally relaxed, and I'm going to try to move the shoulder, and I want to see how far the shoulder can be moved. Now, quite simply, I don't care if it's 5 degrees, 10 degrees, or 100 degrees more. If there is any more motion that is available passively, meaning me moving it, than the range of motion you can move it, that tells you that some aspect of the loss of range of motion is muscular, not structural. For us to say that the cause of pain is adhesive capsulitis or frozen shoulder, the range of motion that you achieve actively must be identical to the range of motion that I achieve when I try to move your arm. You understand that? If there's a structural impedance stopping a joint from going through range of motion, who cares who's trying to move the joint, whether it's you or some other person? The fact is, it's structural. Therefore, the range of motion that can be achieved has to be identical. If you could understand that point, that the diagnosis of frozen shoulder has nothing to do with pain, it has to do with range of motion. And for you to be given the diagnosis of frozen shoulder, your motion, the motion that you could achieve at the shoulder, must be identical to the range of motion that I achieve by doing it and you just simply relaxing and letting me move you. And by the way, it's not the pain that's the impedance. It literally has to have a structural impedance. It has to feel like I can't push any farther through and you can't push any farther through. Again, we ignore the idea of pain as a contributing indicator as to whether frozen shoulder is the cause of your pain. Now, I've been doing this for 28 years. I've seen thousands of people. In this entire time I've treated people's shoulders, I have not once ever come to the position where somebody had the same amount of range of motion, whether they were trying to move their shoulder or whether I tried to move it. You understand what I'm telling you here? In every one of the cases that I have treated where the medical establishment provided the diagnosis of frozen shoulder, I proved that it wasn't frozen shoulder because I was able to move the shoulder through greater range of motion than the individual was able to. Done. End of story. I don't care who told you you have frozen shoulder. If the two types of range of motion don't meet, you don't have frozen shoulder, period. And in fact, the higher probability is that you have a muscular cause. Okay? So, diagnoses count. Words count. If you're being told you have frozen shoulder, you better have the symptoms that represent frozen shoulder. Okay? Now, if we now put that aside and we accept you probably don't have frozen shoulder, especially if you don't have those symptoms, what could potentially be causing it? So let's say that you have some limited range of motion, but it's primarily due to pain. Well, remember that I told you that for the shoulder to move, the arm bone must glide down in the shoulder joint to allow the arm to be raised. That has to happen. For that to happen, the rotator cuff, specifically the infraspinatus and teres minor, two parts of it, are actually connected to the arm bone and then to the back of the shoulder blade. And so by pulling from the shoulder blade and pulling on the head of the arm bone, it pulls the head of the arm bone down while the shoulder is raised, the arm is raised, allowing for normal range of motion. So if you notice there's impedance by pain there, the highest probability is that you strained your rotator cuff, not tore it, strained it. Now, that is probably going to strain as a result of other muscles involved in shoulder function. So you have to understand that the shoulder joint is really where the arm bone is entering the end, the side of the shoulder blade, and the shoulder blade has to be stabilized on the rib cage for the muscles that attach from the arm to the shoulder blade to work properly. So you have to have proper shoulder blade stability. Probably one of those muscles are strained as well, or two of them, and that's causing the rotator cuff to overwork, leading to your pain and the inability to go through range of motion. So I have found that in almost every case, even when there was some indication that there may be a slight element of an arthritic change causing it, the vast majority, in almost all cases, the cause of pain and limited range of motion was a mechanical deficit due to a muscular cause, some sort of weakness of one or more muscles. The only way you're ever going to be able to identify anything that I'm talking about would be through a proper physical evaluation, which is at the core of diagnosing the cause of pain at the Yass method, with the Yass method. So if this is making sense to you and you agree that you probably don't have frozen shoulder based on this, but you want to know what muscles are responsible for creating your symptoms so you can strengthen them appropriately, which means that you have to know how to perform the proper exercise for each muscle. You have to know how to incorporate progressive resistance, which is at the basis of causing muscles to get stronger. You probably need the Yass method. Okay. So hopefully, with this podcast, you'll be able to go somewhere and get a legitimate understanding of how the shoulder joint works. What is the shoulder joint? What makes up the shoulder joint? What causes the shoulder to function properly? And what are the required symptoms to provide frozen shoulder as a legitimate diagnosis? And what are the symptoms that indicate it's not the legitimate diagnosis? The medical establishment basically only has a couple of choices for treatment. They've got basically surgery and cortisone shots and maybe some medication, right? Orthopedists basically have at their availability is surgeries and cortisone shots. So, as long as they can keep pushing cortisone shots and surgery, they're going to keep giving you the diagnoses that justify that. If it's a muscular cause, I can tell you now, surgery or cortisone shots are not going to resolve the problem. But I could also tell you that I have found over the last 28 years that in more than 98% of cases, the cause is muscular. That's why people love the Yass method. That's why they see it as a legitimate alternative to the medical establishment. That's why they see it as transformative because it's empowering them to be able to resolve their pain, in this case, at the shoulder. So hopefully you'll get to hear this. It'll make sense to you. And you'll recognize that the idea of frozen shoulder probably is not related to your situation and your symptoms. And that even better, the great news is that it's most likely muscular and that there's an actual simple and effective way of resolving your pain and returning to full function within weeks or best a month or two. So with that being said, I'm going to end this podcast and hopefully everyone enjoyed the information and finds it beneficial and reaches out. Again, you can contact me at Dr. Mitch at mitchellyass.com or go to my website, livewithoutpains.com/sessions if you want to get a Yass Method Zoom session. So for now, this is Dr. Mitchell Yass, wishing you a pain-free, fully functional life. Bye-bye for now.